Well, great to see everyone. Thanks for giving up some time on your rainy Tuesday. We want to talk about conversion and give you basically trying to teach you how to fish rather than necessarily giving you some fish. So we've tried to sort of start slowly, start with the basics, but also have some more advanced stuff for those of you who are a bit more experienced. So, got it wrong already. In terms of agenda, we'll give a bit of intro. We'll talk about kind of setting up a CRO program for success, which is something I don't think we talk about a lot, but there are definitely kind of things that you need to get in place before you want to start it properly. We'll talk about some conversion myths. There's a lot of like nonsense talked about conversion. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about ICE baby, how to do that. So we'll talk about a framework of how you can think about prioritizing things. We'll go into a bit more detail of some of the advanced topics. And then we'll give you guys some examples and also some sort of places of where you should be looking or places where you should be fishing. So as a quick intro myself, I've worked in growth marketing for 17 years. I used to run the growth team at a business school, Grays. I've advised about 250 startups on growth, and I'm also a lecturer at London Business School.
Yeah, I'm Simon. As the slide says, I have about 8 years working in startups, most of which in growth, with about a year as a software engineer. I used to be a maths teacher, so kind of super into the data side. Yeah, I specialize in conversion, much more than the performance marketing side. Yeah, we didn't stick on intros that long.
So Simon and I used to work together at Clear Mechanics, so we ran the growth process there. So we've went from basically inheriting a fairly bad system to running a very good system, so we can talk through how we did it and some lessons learned along the way. So a quick intro on the company. I think probably a lot of you know, but just in case you don't, growth and company is sort of three components. One is we advise companies on growth, so we work with investors and VCs and founders to support their growth. We then bring in the right people to help that growth, and we also run a community of senior growth folks. We are hiring some conversion roles at the moment to get a small plug-in. So if you're looking for a role, then do drop me a note. And if you are a kind of growth leader and looking for a community, again, ping me a note. So yeah, sales pitch over. So let's dive into conversion. So I think one of the first points to discuss is I don't think people really understand the value of conversion in the grand scheme of a business. So we think about a 20% win in conversion. You're thinking about improving your revenue by 20% and reducing your CAC by 17%. But that's not really the full story. You have a much bigger kind of indirect benefit when you improve conversion. So because your unit economics have improved, you can push your channels higher and you can get more revenue through increasing your CAC. You also open a lot of new channels, so things that were kind of marginal before are probably not marginal now. So it allows you to progress on a lot more channels. So when I was at Grays, like our conversion was extremely high, and pretty much every channel that we did was successful because our conversion was so high. It also has a sort of really strong positive effect on other channels as well. So your organic performance will improve by conversion because you're better at understanding the customer, you're better at talking their language, knowing their pain points. So your kind of webinars or your organic content or your emails are going to hit a bit harder because you have a deeper understanding. And finally, you often get an increase in LTV, which people don't really think about. If you're better at explaining the value proposition to consumers, you're more likely to attract kind of higher paying consumers as well. You're more likely to retain them. So you actually will see some benefits in LTV over the longer term. So let's talk a little bit about setting up for success. Feel free to kind of ping any comments on the chat. We'll kind of answer some of the comments on the way, but we'll do a Q&A at the end. So if you have any burning questions, then shove them in the chat. So I think before we kind of get into the sort of nitty gritty of what you should and shouldn't test, I think it's important to think about how do you set up a CRM program. And I think there's three sort of core components. That one is the people and having the right people, having the right buy-in, which we'll talk about. Second is data. Data is normally fairly straightforward. I think most businesses are quite good at having access to data, whether it's GA or their internal systems. And then we'll talk about kind of insights and why that's important. So in terms of insights, I think this is the area where the vast majority of companies are exceptionally weak. I think companies are good at building, at kind of knowing the data behind their customers, but they're not good at knowing the insights. And I would think about insights in sort of 3 different levels. So the first is your inspiration. So you're gaining sort of anecdotes or reviews from customers where you don't walk in with an agenda in mind. So you're trying to pick up some understanding of like how they're thinking, what their pain points are, how do they discover your product, how do they compare you versus other products, rather than I want to test this, what do you think about this? So that's an important part to make of kind of every day, and really should be essential for every day kind of part of a growth team, regardless of whether it's conversion or not. The second is validation. So you might have some anecdotes, but how common are those anecdotes? Do they happen all the time? When do they show up? And you need sources of how do you validate that. So that could be some internal data analysis, so you kind of deep dive in certain customers. Customer panels are really useful. So having a group of customers that you can talk openly about, and we'll give you some examples of that in the presentation. Surveys are really useful. They're really useful for a validation rather than inspiration. I think a lot of people use them as inspiration, but ultimately they're much better at testing things. So as you write a survey, you're inherently quite biased. And then finally, it's confirmation. So kind of proving out what the insights tell you. And that could be through A/B testing, which is what we'll talk about. That is the gold standard, but there are pros and cons of that. One-to-one interviews can be very powerful. So kind of validating individual ideas with customers. And one of the things that we often don't talk about, but is very important, is learn by selling. So taking an idea and selling it to your customers as the ultimate proof point, rather than saying, would you buy it theoretically? You're saying, all right, get your credit card out. Will you buy this? And that's the ultimate kind of detection. In terms of the human piece, I think this is a really important thing to discuss before we get into too much details. I think there's sort of 3 elements here. So one is getting kind of buy-in from senior stakeholders. Now, conversion takes time. It's not an overnight success. Often I've seen companies trying to do it when they're running out of funding, and they just don't have enough time. So you have to give it a bit of patience, and it takes time, particularly when you're starting from a cold start. And the second point with this is that if you're going to make big changes to conversion, you're going to make quite big changes to the proposition. So moving your CTA button from the left to the right and coloring it pink or blue, whatever it is, it just doesn't make a massive difference. So big changes require big buy-in. And Simon and I had some interesting stories of slight disagreements with our previous founder, let's politely say, in terms of how big these changes would go. And they were comfortable doing small changes, but small changes generally make no impact or minimal impact. The second is ring fencing ownership. I think this is a really, really big one. Is lots of people are aspiring to run a good conversion program, but you get dragged into website breaking, various other kind of challenges that we face in the world of business. And what you really need is a dedicated owner who this is their day job. They're going to run it no matter what. And then you have that consistency. So as the business gets bigger, you do need to hire someone whose job is to run a conversion program, rather than somebody who's wearing multiple hats and will invariably deprioritize conversion to focus on the kind of crisis of that day. And the third is your fairly standard stuff. So kind of some design resource, some dev resource, a bit of data, and a bit of research. Is there any questions on this so far in terms of like setting up for success? Take that as a no. So let's talk about a few conversion myths. So the first one is that small wins add up to big wins. So don't focus on major changes, focus on lots of smaller things, and you'll get there quicker and easier. Now that is false. It's not true. So mathematically that might be true, but in reality there's a few issues here. So one is that small impacts take a long time to test. So the sample size you need is massive, and therefore you have to run that test for a very long time. particularly for an early business or your B2B. Small wins aren't necessarily more likely to be successful than big wins. So a lot of the sort of no-brainer ideas are not necessarily more likely to be successful. And most tests don't work. So if you think about it the other way around, if you're going to find 5 small wins rather than 1 big win, you also have to find a lot of losses and you have to test a lot of things. So actually, this is a big myth. It's better to have fewer, bigger swings of the bat rather than lots of small ones. To use a really sort of cliche quote, if you sort of shoot for the stars, you hit the moon. So if you're aiming for a massive win, it may not be as big a win as you think it is, but it's probably still quite decent. But if you're aiming for lots of incremental wins, you won't add them. If you're a product manager in Apple and you're trying to make your laptop slightly better, you're not going to accidentally discover the iPhone in that process. So you should be trying to radically change your proposition. Maybe it won't work, but you'll still find some decent wins on that process. Second myth is that A/B tests are the only way to test an idea. Again, not true. They are statistically rigorous, but they're expensive and they're slow. There also are areas where they're not possible to do. So A/B testing pricing can have some legal implications and some practical implications as well. But there are other ways that you can test a hypothesis much quicker. So customer surveys, customer interviews, running a smoke test. If you guys aren't familiar with a smoke test is where the product looks like it's the real thing, but it doesn't exist behind the scenes. So you could have a landing page which has 2 options, a basic and a premium. And when you click on the premium, it records that you clicked on the premium, but nothing happens. So you're trying to get a sense of whether there's demand before you've built that. And often you can look in your internal data and get a good understanding of whether something would work or not when you're really viewing it. So myth 3, this is a no-brainer. Probably the most used and abused phrase in conversion. It's bloody not a no-brainer. You should try and remove that term from your vocabulary. It's really, really not helpful. Just because the competitor has it, your founder thinks a good idea, it's generally considered best practice, doesn't make it a good idea. Each business faces different nuances, and I can give you lots of examples of businesses that have done exactly the opposite of best practice and be very successful. Implementing no-brainers also causes a lot of technical testing debt, which is a phrase I invented. So where you add lots of little things to a site and then your conversion goes down, you don't know whether those little things made a difference or not, or it's just general fluctuations. So Simon and I had lots of situations where we would implement things without testing them properly, and then we had to very carefully unpick all of the different things that we tested to figure out whether our conversion was just bad because it was summer, or did we screw it up by something that we did, or was there a bug? So remove the phrase no-brainers from your vocabulary and try and test everything. We'll talk about that. So to summarize on this, the sort of important things to realize with conversion is that most things don't work, right? Just because you're super smart and you're the founder and you've looked at all the data, it doesn't mean you're going to be successful. So as soon as you understand that, you then think, okay, well, how do I increase my hit rate? And so how do I, we typically talk about a kind of 1 in 10 success rate for CRO, which actually is quite big for some companies, but you basically have 1 in 10, 1 is successful, 1 is a failure, and 8 are flat. And if you can improve that metric slightly, it makes a massive difference. And the flip side of that is you also want to learn who the losers are very quickly without spending a lot of money or a lot of time on discovering that. Does that all make sense? We're going to have, there's a thumb up, well done. But yeah, feel free to click. Love it. Feel free to throw some comments in there. Right, I will pass over to my glamorous assistant. Oops,
Hello. So we're going to talk a little bit about ICE. ICE, baby. I won't make the same bad dad joke that Joseph did and indulge him. So without ICE, as Joseph was saying, most tests don't work. So you will end up with a process that looks like the one on the bottom, where you just kind of chuck shit at a wall, and eventually you get a winner. And the point of the ICE process is that we're going to take a little bit more time on each idea, properly validate those ideas before we get to test level, and therefore increase the test success rate and move a lot quicker as a result. So you can see in a good process to get like 2 wins before chucking shit at a wall finds you even one.
And that is the technical phrase of chucking shit at a wall.
So the key idea here is that we're going to quantify confidence to prioritize. So I think it's very common to have a backlog of ideas, and then you kind of score them on how big the idea is going to be and how easy it is. But the missing piece is often confidence, and often in businesses where people try and score it, they don't actually do it in a rigorous way. So here, instead of just doing impact times ease, we're going to answer the key question, which is what level of evidence do we have to support our impact estimate? And then we multiply all of those 3 together to prioritize.
So just a sort of quick show of hands, are people kind of familiar with the basic principles of the ICE process? Yeah, cool. Yeah, we'll talk about the kind of nuanced ICE process that we'll go through. Love these thumbs up, great.
So yeah, confidence isn't based on gut feel. It should be a defined scale, which can be like validated objectively. So everyone should be able to say this is the confidence 3 and this is why. So we put kind of an example scale that we use, the click mechanic on the right, where personal opinion really just doesn't have much importance at all as in terms of like rigor, whereas 10 out of 10 is kind of the highest you're going to get before you actually kind of implement something as an A/B test. So when you're using ICE, you're going to be moving things up the confidence scale, i.e. that's validating your ideas. So that's often going to mean getting more data from another source, or getting data from another source. If you have obviously more sources of user insight, if they're all agreeing, then the thing is more likely to be true. And if they're disagreeing, you can often find out a lot about your customers by trying to work out why.
I'll just take the comment that was in the Slack. So kind of ICE versus RICE. So for those who aren't familiar, RICE is the same, but you add a new variable, which is reach. In terms of this, what we use is the impact, which would be the financial, would generally be the revenue, depending on the business, but would be the kind of clear North Star metric. In businesses where the sort of P&L metric and the sort of wider metrics are harder to view, RICE can be really powerful. So for example, if you're Meta, getting people to engage a few more minutes a day on Meta doesn't necessarily have a neat correlation to advertising revenue. So in these sorts of situations, having RICE can be quite useful. So I think ideally you would use ICE and you'd have a clearer view of like revenue or whatever your metric may be. If the relationship between revenue is a bit more ambiguous, then you might want to have reach, which would cover what proportion of your base was covered. So does that make sense, Alex?
I might just follow up separately because there's something I don't quite follow about that. When it would be useful and when it wouldn't be.
Yeah, I think the way I think about it is slightly different to Joseph. So I'll have my 2 cents while we're here. Is I essentially think RICE is just splitting up what we're calling impact into 2 kind of separate measures, which is like reach and then impact by customer. I think even in the kind of Facebook example, you'd just have a rough like translation rates of minutes to revenue, which you just like work out with your data team. You put everything in the same metric, which is revenue. I think you can use RICE and apply like basically all of these principles. If you prefer to split that out, it doesn't change a lot of the framework.
Cool.
So yeah, using ICE, you're going to have your kind of backlog, and you're going to do 2 things. You're going to be testing the idea that's at the top of the list, and you'll be able to test that in a couple of ways that we'll talk about later. And then those with the highest potential score, so impact times ease, they're the ones that you want to prioritize to go and like validate your hypothesis and see if they're true, because they could have the biggest impact if so. So consistently on a kind of week-to-week basis, you'll have something like this. You're going to get user insight in, which is your inspiration part that Joseph was talking about, to generate your CRO ideas. You're going to score each idea using the ICE framework, using those defined scales. You're going to take forward the best ideas, so that's testing the top scoring and validating the highest potential, and then you're going to run your tests and then refine and launch. So learn from your losers and implement your winners quickly. So on a high level, that's using ICE in your conversion process.
So have we lost you yet? So a bit of a recap on this. So we've set up your process, have access to data, have lots more ways of bringing in insights. Yeah, we'll talk about that in a sec, Johnny. What we're saying is using the ICE process, but the difference that you're probably doing at the moment is instead of saying, I think it's going to work 70%, you have a defined scale and everyone in the business understands what that means. So therefore, you're kind of removing personal opinion from the equation. To answer your question, Johnny, in terms of, sorry, just go back a bit. In terms of the impact, so the impact ideally should be the financial impact on the business. So it could, we used to use revenue per week because that's how we viewed success in the business. Profit per week and revenue per week for us were the same because we had a fixed percentage, but it could be active users, it could be something else. Now your impact score, you want to score correctly for the level of impact. So the impact score is not a 1 to 10, because if a project is 100 times more important than another project, it should be getting a score which is 100 times more important. So you can calibrate these things based on the kind of practical needs of the business, but you're basically viewing it on a level of success of that North Star metric. Does that make sense, Johnny?
Yeah, that's super. That's a big change to what I've seen previously, but that makes total sense.
We used to do it as a 1 to 10, and then we had an idea which we called Unicorn, which was going to transform the business, and it was 500 times bigger than everything else. So we gave it a score 500 times bigger because it reflected the reality of what it was. In some situations, the impact can be. Sorry, go over, Johnny.
Yeah, no, I think it's good. It probably allows like more breadth of ideas into one prioritization framework. Whereas if you've broken down your North Star metric into maybe more specific key drivers, then maybe like 1 to 10. If you're getting like quite specific, then maybe 1 to 10 works. But I think, yeah, for these size of businesses, actually you need to be able to have like unicorn ideas on the same page as much smaller ideas to help you prioritize.
Yeah, I think that's a very point, is that the idea is to have one ICE process, ideally. So you're looking at, retention, acquisition ideas, upsell ideas, all in the same currency. And that's why having revenue is a good currency, because it is the currency you look at, because it helps with prioritization across the business. So this might be the most important idea for your team, but it's like the 20th most important idea for our team, and therefore we should be using our resources in a different way.
Okay, nice. Let's have a look in detail at a few of the steps that you're going to take. So if you have something in the ICE sheet, the kind of 2 ways that you can improve the score once you've estimated how big you think the idea is you can either increase your confidence in it, or you can make it easier to build. So the first thing, building confidence, this is going to be like validating your idea. So you're either going to be, like I said earlier, getting more data from a single source if you're on a low number. It's going to be getting new sources of user insight. Do you have existing user insight kicking around that you can go and investigate? Do you have user recordings? Do you have a pop-up on your chat where you can look at the responses? You can look through customer service responses. Could you validate your hypothesis using internal sales data, and so on? So you're going to look to see if you can find out if this is true in multiple places. If you haven't got the data available, then you're going to need to go and get some new insight. And so on the right, you can see kind of in practice, what validating does to your prioritization. So idea 3, the one with the biggest potential, was sitting at 3rd in the list on the top. And then as a result of doing some validation work, we've increased our confidence to a 5, but we've also learned more about the idea in the process. So we've revised our impact estimate as well. We didn't think it was going to be as big as before, and so we've updated our score on all the parameters. And as you validate your idea, you'll realize you'll revise your impact score to make it more accurate, and you'll also kind of like implement the idea in a better way as you learn more about your customers.
Yeah, so I think one of the sort of issues that people have with conversion testing is you run A/B test, you implement it, and it doesn't work as well as you thought it did. And one of the reasons is because you probably haven't understood the nuances of who it's impacting. So does it impact kind of new customers versus returning in a different way? So it's part of your confidence building. You'll also understand a bit more of the nuances of, is the problem, how wide is this problem or this opportunity that we're finding? And that's so your impact will go up and down as you kind of get more confidence in it.
You often slightly misdiagnose the problem as well, as you kind of see in one of our examples later. And we took an extra iteration from a test because we didn't understand the customer well enough the first time. So kind of how to validate quickly, the kind of two things that you're trying to remember here is like speed massively beats perfection. You're not trying to like test whether this idea is 100% true or not. You're just trying to move it up the scale and get it closer to the testing point. So you want to try and validate your hypothesis as quickly and as cheaply as possible. So it's like I said on the previous slide, getting more insight from old sources. And if you want to get new sources, some easy ways to do it. Email your customers and see if they want to buy it. So you get like sign-ups on the wait list, you get clicks on smoke tests to kind of ensure demand before you build it. If you have a in-person sales team, they're an absolute goldmine for getting user insight. Worked with one at Lively, and constantly they would be feeding back to me like what's working, what isn't, what's selling and what's not, and that's absolute gold to then like refine the proposition on the website and like improve the messaging throughout the company. So here you could change your sales pitch and see what your customers say. You're going to get instant feedback, and you only have to do it on a small number without like having great risk. Or you can just go and get more data of like the kind of classic sources, go do some interviews, look at your recordings and your analytics, and you'll be able to build confidence in your ideas without spending testing time and engineering resource on A/B tests.
Yeah. So a lot of this stuff is useful to set up in advance. So we had a sort of focus group of our users, and they were on WhatsApp, and we could literally WhatsApp them an idea and say, is this a problem for you guys? And they would reply very quickly. So some of this is about setting up the processes so you can very quickly validate things. And then, yeah, the other side of the coin is, can you make this a lot quicker and easier to build? So the aim is to develop much quicker without losing major functionality and features. So engineering is like usually the bottleneck in terms of getting stuff built and features implemented. That's usually why you're doing the prioritization in the first place. It's often not what you expect that uses dev time. I realized this when I was working in growth. I realized this even more having worked as a software engineer. You'd be really surprised. Some things you think are really simple can take a week. Some things you think are really complicated can be like a couple of hours. So like unless you're quite technical, you're probably going to get it wrong. And so the idea is just ask them, bring them into the process really early on, talk to them about the ideas that you are thinking about, how easy they're going to be to build. And if they say it's going to be really hard, like work out which bits are going to be the hard things to build and work out if you can remove them while keeping the kind of like meat of the test in the future. I think multiple times we like took things that would take 2 weeks to build down to 2 days. And as a result, those projects actually got prioritized and built. Otherwise, they would have had no chance. So on the right, yeah, you can kind of see an example of that here. By working with engineers, kind of de-scoped how long it'll take to build idea 5. So it's gone from an ease 3 to a 10. Now it's top of the ice sheet, so it's ready to be tested. And this goes back to the no-brainer idea. I think one mistake that people make is they when they're going to change something, they think, well, we might as well change multiple things simultaneously. Now, that massively increases the time it takes to do it, but also increases the noise around it. So to give an example, a client of mine, they rebuilt their checkout. It took 5 engineers 2 months, and it was up 30%, which is great. But they also removed their discount code box simultaneously, and that probably was the cause of all of their conversion improvement, and they could have tested that within 5 minutes. It was a very simple bit of deleting code. So it's important to kind of work with the engineers to de-scope things. And this is a little bit counterintuitive, because we're taught to do things, at school, we're taught to do things properly and, do it well, but we're not doing that here. We're doing it rough and ready, and then we can go back and figure out all the edge cases and the kind of weird nuances. We just want to get a quick test live, validate whether it works, and then we'll go back and do things properly. But it's counterintuitive.
Okay, so you've kind of gone through your process, you've got your thing at the top of your ice sheet, and you're ready to test. And so you've got to kind of select your test. I'm sure you're all probably familiar with A/B tests, like make a new version, randomize the users, and see what happens. So this is the most rigorous. It's the kind of marketing equivalent of a randomized control trial, but it's not always possible, and it can be really slow. So reasons why it's not possible is the thing is really difficult to test. So pricing can be a nightmare to A/B test. There's not great tools for doing it. Often, like you mentioned, your prices in your advertising, you have to think about the whole flow, and it can just be easier to change them. Another case where A/B testing becomes kind of unfeasible is if you're kind of really early stage, and your traffic volumes are particularly low. The testing time is just going to be way too long in order to be feasible, talking orders of months. And in which case you just have to kind of validate your ideas and make some changes, and then kind of analyze and see what's happened, which is kind of the layman's way of saying discontinuity analysis. So you make a change, and you look for a change in your metrics. So here, if the underlying data is stable, you have a kind of stronger baseline. If the risks are low from the change, so if you screw it up, it's not a big downside, then you can consider this as an alternative to A/B testing.
I think one thing that we didn't mention in the beginning stage is having a very simple to use set of metrics. So one of the things that we did very well at Click Mechanic is we tracked about 150 KPIs weekly from the day the business was started until the present day. And you can look at lots of different trends that happen. So for example, if your NPS improves, you probably would expect your referral rate to improve, but it's going to improve very slowly. And also that data is on different sources. So your NPS is probably like a survey tool, and your repeat rate is probably something internal. At the moment, those don't communicate. So having a sort of central source of truth with metrics from different part of the business, you'll often find some opportunities. So with conversion at Click Mechanic, we improved our AOV at the same time, because customers were more comfortable putting very large orders through the system, because we generally kind of reassured them on lots of issues. But the A/B testing tool doesn't measure the AOV, and then your internal system doesn't measure the conversion. So a central source of truth, a good old Google sheet is brilliant. It's very manual, but the time it takes you to manually update it is good kind of thinking time. So I think about the kind of ramifications of those data, and sometimes, as Simon said, the change is quite small, but you just want to measure it over time.
Yeah, the only thing I would add there is I think in the end we did marry up our kind of A/B testing tools to the actual transaction data, but it was a complete faff. But yeah, you can get kind of advanced and test these things directly after a while. So just a couple of top tips for A/B testing, or kind of common mistakes I see. The first is definitely choose your sample size in advance. It's so tempting when you're running a test to check it, and checking it's fine, but deciding whether to stop it is not fine in terms of getting results for the business. The reason is that every time you look at it and decide oh, should we stop the test, you're increasing the chance of a false positive if you do that more than once, because there's a probability you're wrong each time. So if you get lots of false positives, what that means is that you think you're getting loads of wins, and then your metrics don't move, and that sucks for everybody. So choose your sample size in advance is number one little kind of mathematical tip I can give you. There's calculators available on Google that you can plug in your kind of various metrics for the test, and it will tell you what sample size will give you more confidence. The second thing I would say is consider your confidence level. We're kind of taught through lots of academia, your P is 0.05 for the technical amongst us, means you're 95% sure that this isn't just chance. And this level is often way too high for a business context. The way that the math works is the closer to 100 you get, the more sample size you need. And so like reducing the confidence level down to 80% is a small kind of decrease in like your certainty level, but you can be a big increase in your speed in terms of testing time. So it's worth just thinking about what's right for your business context, especially if you're at the smaller kind of like number of transactions stage.
Yeah, I remember we ran a few A/B tests where we made a mistake, and we ran an AA test, and the two were identical, both arms of them, because we made a mistake in the code. And the difference of the two arms was enormous over periods of time. So we'd be like, oh shit, we've got to end this test, we're going to lose loads of money, and then you realize that it's testing against itself. So there can be a lot of variance when you're looking at it, and there is a huge temptation to look every day or multiple times a day, but try and avoid that. And it goes back to getting buy-in from senior leaders as well. You need to teach them a little bit of this, because if they look at that test and it's down by 20%, there's going to be panic, but it could be up by 20% if you gave it a bit longer.
To be honest, yeah, that AA test was actually quite useful in terms of like people realizing that the like test can bounce around, and it may even be a nice way to get buy-in from your senior leadership is run an AA test and show them like what the randomness actually looks like.
But it's how you test. It's how you calibrate A/B testing tools.
Yeah.
But yeah, no.
So learning from your losers, one of our best insights came from an unsuccessful test, which you can see on the bottom of the screen. I made a mistake in the code. And by accident, which wasn't part of our test design, we removed the dealer price from the kind of comparison where a customer got their quote. And we saw the conversion was down about 23%, a little bit of an oops on my part. But we paused it early. We saw like, God, we're losing loads of money. Something must be like bugged in this. Realized what we've done. And as a result, we realized that the price was really important. Prices are opaque in this market, and customers don't have a clear benchmark. And it kind of led us on to like a whole kind of like thread of thinking about pricing, which delivered our biggest like revenue wins, with about 60% revenue increase across business in 3 months from changing our prices. We would have never got onto that thread of thinking had we not screwed up this test. So kind of every cloud has a silver lining. And the key point is like improving the model of your customer is going to just generate more good ideas in the future. And that's the point of the conversion testing. It will improve how you like change the business proposition. It will improve how you advertise, and it will also generate you more sales directly.
Yeah, I mean, that was a massive kind of aha moment of like, wow, pricing is really, really important. And then they gave us loads and loads of ideas of how we thought about it. So even like, you know, copying emails was much more kind of price focused rather than quality focused, and everything had a benefit just from a test that was ultimately unsuccessful.
And then, yeah, launch your winners really quickly. You don't have to wait for engineers when you have a successful test. Just run 100% on the A/B testing tool through the successful one. So you're actually getting the benefit immediately, but do make sure that you get the engineers like to implement it properly quickly. If you don't do this, after a while, you'll build up technical debt. A nice thing that we did is reserving space in future sprints for iterations or implementations of successful tests. Once you kind of get a good machine going, it should be like relatively predictable when tests are going to finish. And then if they're successful, make sure you have the space in the sprint for when they're going to finish. If not, you'll always have another feature in your backlog you can put in instead. And then, yeah, report back on the impact of wins, just as in the same way, picking up loads of wins and the metrics not moving is really demoralizing. Getting loads of wins and the metrics moving is really like energizing for a business. And conversions are really a whole company effort. The more you kind of integrate the ICE process in, the more you'll realize like lots of the ideas are coming from all over the place. Lots of your user validation is coming from customer service. The engineers are helping you estimate. Like everyone's going to be involved in some way in this effort. And so if people can see that it's working, it's just really energizing. So definitely report back.
Yeah, internal marketing is a strong thing as well. So we used to call our projects after animal names. Because it was fun, and also because it was easier for the customer service guys to kind of buy into it. They'd be like, oh, what's happening with Hippo? Like, tell me about Hippo. What's going on? Getting guys kind of engaged with the process is really useful. So senior management, but also the kind of guys in customer service, the salespeople, those sorts of people as well.
Yeah, I remember Project Whale because it was really big. Yeah, you can have some fun with it. I think, and then at Lively, I think we named them after like films. So like sci-fi films, I think it was in particular. So yeah, just like pick a theme, like run with it, whatever's like fun for your company. Okay, so some boring stuff, but it's really important. First of all, like have somewhere where you like track all your tests. It doesn't need to be fancy, just like a one-line description of what you're testing, what the result was, and like what the kind of outcome is in terms of actions, and then a link to an experiment doc. And this is where you have a little bit more detail. You put your hypothesis down, you write down like what the evidence was that got you to that confidence level, take a couple of screenshots of the test and the results. This kind of stuff, like it sounds really boring and dull. It took me maybe like 25 minutes a week at Click Mechanic, and in the end it saved us way more time than it took in terms of like not going back and like trying to look up old tests, not trying to work out like what it was about this test that worked. So yeah, you're going to forget what you did, and so writing it all down is really important. It also forces you to have clear hypotheses. I'm sure everyone's had the experience of like having something kind of fuzzy in your head, and when you're forced to put it on paper, it kind of like becomes a lot clearer for you. If you're doing that with all of your ideas, you'll make sure you actually like know what you're testing. Last thing is the people aren't going to necessarily be the same within the team over time, but the company needs to keep those learnings so that anyone who's kind of coming in can see what's been tested. You don't have to answer the same question 300 times about have we tested this, have we tested that, and it just makes everything run a lot smoother. Yeah.
It also gives you can go back to some of these tests and they were unsuccessful, and with hindsight you'll kind of realize why they're unsuccessful, so you can kind of go back to the data.
Yeah, finally, some kind of wider benefits of ICE. Bigger ideas are prioritized. If something has a big impact score, you can try and like bring the ease down and the confidence up, and they're usually the ones that end up at the top of the list. Not always, but pretty much. And so because those ideas get prioritized and actually implemented, it encourages people to come up with them. And basically anyone should be able to like put an idea on the ice sheet from anywhere in the business. It shouldn't just be the growth team that comes up with ideas. It forces customer insight as part of the process. If you haven't got your customer insight, like the idea won't get prioritized and tested. And so it like forces you into a good habit on that part. I think it does the same thing with the descoping of ideas. It forces you into a good habit because that's actually how you get the ideas to the top of the sheet. It means all ideas are treated on their merits. So you may know the HIPPO method, the highest paid person's opinion, which is a kind of like often how companies prioritize. But here you don't have who put the idea in the sheet, you just have the idea and the scores. So it's just treated on the objective evidence. And yeah, I kind of mentioned the last one already. Who does the scoring is a really good question, actually. So typically you have like kind of one person to like score the impact. When I was at Click Mechanic, that was me. What I would do is I would make sure it was transparent. So I'd kind of like leave comments as to like how I did the calculation, and then it was kind of open for challenge by anyone who thought my math was wrong. And like we did change stuff because I got stuff wrong, but just have one person to do the initial scoring and kind of like show their reasoning. And then like in your kind of like prioritization, you'll like work out if you think those like assumptions and calculations are true. Yeah. As for ease, I would let the engineers do it, and confidence should be pretty easy to score, but yeah, just pick a name.
Cool. So in the final section, we've got a few examples, and as I said, we've also got some sort of areas to go fishing. We've hopefully picked some ideas that are relevant for lots of businesses that you can think about. What is my version of what they said? Shall I?
This is your baby. I'll do the others.
Yeah, I like some. So it's a few examples that we have in Click Mechanic, and then we'll kind of talk about the sort of general view as well. So what we did is to keep it simple, we split one product into 3 products, a small, medium, and large. It was incredibly easy to do. It took the engineers about a day to do. It was a bit of research to figure out what should be in each component, but it was pretty straightforward. And I think one thing with product teams is they don't typically like these unsexy things. They like launching brand new products, but we were basically just repackaging the same one. AOV went up, conversion went up. We pushed our bidding higher on our platforms. and we had a pretty massive win in a very short space of time. Unfortunately, it was only worth about 20% of the business, but it was still a massive win in a small part of the business. And almost every business can benefit from these sorts of wins.
Okay, this is the one I mentioned earlier about how we turned a loser into a winner. So we have on the left what the page originally looked like. It was just a big list of categories. And then we kind of got some user insight that people were struggling with it. One, because they were telling us from a little pop-up saying, hey, why aren't you buying? Two, we watched them go through this page and it was super clunky. And three, saw heat maps which showed that the search bar, which is below the fold, many users didn't even see it. So they were just kind of struggling through these categories, didn't even see the search bar. And so we were like, this is an opportunity for a win. Let's try the extreme. They can't see the search bar. The search is much easier. Our search tool is really good. Let's just put the search tool there. And then it was down 20%, which wasn't ideal. So then we're like, okay, well, let's try and work out what's gone wrong. Looked at more user recordings of the users in the test, and saw that like people were really unsure what to look for. They didn't like have the trust in the search tool. And we also saw in our transactions data that basically 15 jobs made up 80% of the sales. So we surfaced the popular ones, put the categories back behind a drop down and left the search bar there, and then eventually saw a 15% improvement in conversion.
I think it's sort of a good learning for you guys on this is try and test the extreme version. So we did another page where we thought the page was too long and too confusing. So we got rid of all the content and the conversion went down. And then we realized that the content was super useful because people read it. And then we put it back in even more and conversion went up. So the more extreme the testing, the quicker the test will be and the more you will learn from it. Even if you don't intend to run the extreme, it's good to test the extreme, because if it doesn't move the needle on the extreme, it's not going to move the needle at like a minor difference to what you're trying to do.
And then the last one is kind of a win where you don't do an idea, which is really underrated. So the proposal was to build like a new shiny mechanic app because the one we had was super clunky. But then we took it to some mechanics and was like, hey, what do you think? And they were like, the app's rubbish, but we know how to use it. And it's not the reason that we don't take the jobs. It's because of the price and difficulty of the job. So we scrapped the project completely, saved a month of engineering time and put it on things that actually worked instead.
Yeah. Just because something's shit doesn't mean making it better is going to move your metric, which is an important learning on this one. There was a question from the chat in terms of sample sizes. It's probably a question for you, Simon.
This was quite a while ago. I don't remember the exact sample sizes. I would just put it in a calculator, kind of based on like detecting minimum uplift of probably about 10%, confidence level about 85. And then like seeing what came out. It was like we had enough traffic then to be able to run the test in about 1 to 2 weeks, so I wasn't like in a particular rush. But yeah, I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head.
Yeah, for some businesses, it can be worth running them for a full cycle. So some businesses can be quite sensitive to payday. So sometimes you might want to run a month of it, assuming that's a big enough sample as well. But generally, it's a statistical question rather than a business question. Right, so finally, before we go to Q&A, so where to fish? Try to have some ideas that were relevant to a broad audience. So pricing, people are scared of it. Makes a massive difference. Can be difficult to A/B test, but doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It's normally incredibly easy to implement. It's literally a line of code, but it can make a huge difference. So don't be scared of pricing. In terms of the example we had, to think about evolving products to appeal to different audiences. So can you, have a look at the extremes of your orders? If you're a B2C business and somebody's just ordered, your average AOV is like £50 and someone's just ordered 10 grand, get on the phone and talk to them, because they probably are a use case which is interesting, and you can figure out how common is that in the future. So look at extremes of your don't just look at averages, look at extremes. Think about kind of bundling and unbundling, both to drive upsell and to make a more value tier. So the sort of classic SaaS example of like small, medium, and large, you can fiddle with the different levels of those so that you kind of nudge customers to the right one. So if you make your large slightly bigger than your medium, then they're more likely to go large. If you make your large really extreme, then the medium looks like great value. So there's a lot of mileage in fiddling with the tiers of stuff and adding and subtracting, particularly when it appeals to a different audience. A slightly more complex thing to test is think about kind of changing the buying journey. So if you're a healthcare business and you have a very difficult product, running a sort of e-commerce style, add to basket may not be the right view. Having a sort of more detailed like questionnaire type model where you ask them different questions can be really valuable. For things like jewelry, people will default to e-commerce, but actually a kind of detailed list of what do you like to do, what price point, who's it for, it can give you the right answer. Think about kind of when payments are made, which is a really big one. We played with this a lot at Click Mechanic, but thinking about, can you give them a bit of the product first before you start charging them? So a kind of free trial or a sort of lower version. Can you charge a company rather than an individual? Can you make it a B2B proposition rather than B2C? There's a lot of mileage in this as an idea. They can be quite difficult to test because you can have to build them. But situations where you're kind of rebranding an existing product can be a huge win because the actual underlying product that you're buying is the same, but you're kind of repackaging it in different sort of bundles or groups. So yeah, that's all we had. We open it up to some questions. I'll pick on random people if you don't have questions.
Go on.
Yeah, over it.
Low traffic B2B. Have you got any clever stuff to combat low traffic B2B and trying to test in that environment beyond anything you've said?
Shall I take this on?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts, but you can go first.
Well, I mean, B2B is great because you've got a sales team. So you can just change the script and you can say, right, tomorrow you're going to pitch this and today you're going to pitch this. So you can get insights very quickly depending on how big the deal size is. A/B testing when your sample size is going to be low is probably not the answer, but sort of customer insight, if you talk to 50 customers and 40 of them want one thing versus the other, that's pretty statistically significant. Basically more customers and using your sales team effectively.
Those are pretty much my thoughts. I was going to say, yeah, you've got to lean really hard into the other sources of validation. Your sales team will be the biggest.
Michael?
Hey, thanks for the talk. Some really good insights. My question is around really long purchase funnels. So if you've got a big purchase journey with, say, 8 steps, how do you think about metrics and measurement for a really long journey like that? Would you still focus on the North Star metric, or would you think about conversion to next step as something that you want to think about to try and sort of break it down into smaller parts?
In general, if you have like anything approaching a reasonable sample size, I'd go for the metric you actually care about, which is sales. We noticed a lot with like some of our tests in Click Mechanic that you change part of the funnel and it would increase the micro conversion, but you're not actually pushing kind of through like traffic with intent to the next stage. And so like that next stage becomes a different like signifier of intent, and you haven't actually changed the metrics overall in the funnel. Just kind of like push people a bit further along before they fall out. And that's not very helpful. It doesn't earn you any revenue. The only reason I'd like look at micro conversions is basically when your sample sizes are really low and you have no other way of like making the testing time reasonable.
Cool, thank you.
I'd also say you're evaluating tests not just on one big A/B test. You're looking at it on different areas. So if the customers are saying very strong things about it, then that does give you an indication that they're going to convert later in the funnel as well. You just got to be pragmatic around the kind of natures of what the product is. Lena?
Hi. Well, I have a question about A/B tests on landing pages. The company I'm working for used to do a lot of it, but our team recommend to the A/B test to be like valid, that it has like 100 conversions per variant. and need to run for, I don't know, 2 weeks straight. So is there any way to estimate or calculate this minimum amount, the minimum necessary to validate an A/B test for landing pages in general?
Yeah, you'll be able to like find the sample size you need to get to kind of any confidence level for kind of any A/B test, not just on LinkedIn pages. Yeah, I think Jonathan just put like a link in the chat. If you Google, there's plenty of others as well. So just pick one that you like. They should all give you basically the same answer. Yeah, and then just think about your confidence level, as I mentioned in the presentation. I don't know if your team is saying like they need to get to 95% confidence, but given the testing time, it might be appropriate to say, hey, we actually only need to be 85% confident and we can test it in a week instead, rather than 2 weeks.
Okay,
There was a
thanks.
question in the chat about getting people to survey. Paying them does work. There's a slight bias there because the ones who take the money are the ones who are probably more price sensitive. So bear that in mind. It can make quite a big difference. The users that we had were just quite engaged, so they kind of liked the product. We deliberately picked people who didn't love the product, and if they were kind of blindly saying that we were great, we didn't put them in the group because we wanted to be challenged. I think if you give them some wider context of like why they're doing it, people are generally quite responsive. You could also play around with like prize rather than a payment. But I think if you give them a bit of context of why they're doing it, they're normally a bit more responsive.
A kind of alternative approach you can take to this, not appropriate for all businesses, but at Alva we had essentially like a nice community. So everyone who bought the product was also invited to the community, and it was pretty just like low budget. It's just a Facebook group where they could chat to each other, because for lots of menopausal women, like the lack of like support and like talking about it amongst their friends was one of the kind of major pain points that we were solving. But it also basically gave us like massively like loads of insight from like how they talk to each other, but also a place we can go and like test things out and ask them what we're thinking. So if you get a community together, it can be really, really helpful for getting user insight.
Any other quick questions before we wrap up? Well, cheers, guys. Thanks a lot for your time. We recorded it, so we'll send it through. If you have any questions or have any other things or you have any kind of nuances, feel free to reach out to either of us. And yeah, have a good Tuesday. And yeah, good to speak to you guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Cool. Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.